Hey, Katie. We have the Bungalow Mystery, Chapter 3, Strange Guardians. Nancy was almost certain now that she and Helen had met the unpleasant Mrs. Aborn the night before. The woman's quarrelsome mood had extended to Laura. Aloud, Helen said, "But don't forget, it's no fun to have car troubles on a bad night. That is apt to make anyone cross." "I suppose so," Laura conceded. "How was Mrs. Aborn this morning?" Nancy asked. Laura's face brightened somewhat as she admitted that the woman had been pleasant and charming. "Mrs. Aborn apologized for her actions last night and said both she and her husband could hardly wait for me to come and live with them." "I see," said Nancy, but with inward reservations. "I guess I'm being foolish to worry." Miss Laura smiled. "Mrs. Aborn did say she had met Mother only once, so that could explain the name mix-up." "Where's Mr. Aborn?" Helen asked. "He's arriving after lunch today. He was detained on business." Nancy was puzzled. The Aborns' behavior was unusual and thoughtless, she felt. "Mrs. Aborn is having her hair set at the beauty parlor in the hotel," Laura explained. "She suggested I take a taxi here this morning if I felt I had to see you two, which I insisted I did," Laura said, grinning cheerfully. Suddenly, Nancy smiled. "I'm starved." She asked Laura to have a second breakfast with her and Helen in the motel restaurant. "And afterward," Helen went on, "let's ask Marty Malone, that girl we met yesterday, Nancy, to make a foursome in tennis." "Great," Laura said to both suggestions. When the three girls stepped outside, Nancy took a deep breath of air. She loved the earthy smell of the forests surrounding the lake resort, particularly the scent of the tall pines. "What a day!" she exclaimed. Only a few fleecy white clouds broke the clear blue sky. "The weathermen must be on our side," Helen chuckled. A little later, Nancy lent Laura tennis clothes, and the girls went to meet Marty Malone. Soon the four were playing a lively set on the courts located behind the motel. Laura and Nancy, who were partners, won. Helen and Marty took the second set. "You're a terrific player, Nancy!" Laura exclaimed as she scored a point during set 3. "Thanks," Nancy said as they changed courts for service. "Where did you learn to play so well?" "Private lessons," Laura grimaced. "At boarding school. Mother insisted. Before her illness she was a great sportswoman." When Nancy and Laura had won the third set, Laura called for time out. "I must go back to the hotel now," she said. "It's almost noon." After Laura had changed her clothes, Nancy offered to drive her to the hotel. The three girls piled into Nancy's blue convertible. 10 minutes later, they drew up in front of the spacious Montewego Hotel. It was several stories high and stood a long distance back from the main road. In front stretched a green lawn bordered by beds of multicolored gladioli, dahlias, and giant asters. "It's beautiful," Nancy commented as Laura stepped from the car. Helen pointed to an attractive outdoor swimming pool to the right of the hotel. It was filled with bathers. Laura said that there was also a riding stable behind the Montewego. "There are a lot of families here," Laura said wistfully. "I wish I could stay." Then hastily she thanked Nancy for driving her over. "I love doing it," Nancy replied. "I hope we see each other again, Laura." "So do I," Helen added. Laura snapped her fingers. "I have a wonderful idea. Why don't you girls come back around 3 o'clock? You can meet my guardians. And if there's time, we can join the other young people at a tea dance scheduled for 4. "Fine," said Nancy at once. "Come directly to my room." Laura waved goodbye. Nancy detected a worried expression on Laura's face and knew she hated the thought of meeting her strange new guardians. The young sleuth was so quiet on the return trip that Helen said, "Penny for your thoughts, Nancy?" Her friend smiled. "I've concluded that the Pendletons must have been wealthy." "What gives you that idea?" "It's very expensive to live year-round in New York hotels where Laura lived, and she also mentioned boarding school. In addition," Nancy enumerated, "Laura's clothes have that simple but expensive look. You know what I mean." "Yes," said Helen. "Well, if you're right, Mr. Aborn will control a great deal of money while he's managing Laura's affairs." "In the case of a minor," said Nancy, "an inheritance is held in trust until she's 21, Dad says. That's 5 years for Mr. Aborn. I hope he'll be a wise guardian." She turned onto Lakeview Lane, a long, straight road bordered by woods. There was no homes along the way, but a sign advertised Sterling's real estate office. Suddenly, Nancy stopped. "I think I'll run in here for a minute," she said, "and ask who owns that bungalow we helped ourselves to." She walked into the office, introduced herself to Mr. Sterling, an elderly man, and told him the purpose of her call. The realtor grinned. "Any port in a storm is all right, I'm sure." He said that the bungalow was owned by one of his clients. He had rented it a week before to a Mrs. Frank Marshall from Pittsburgh. "I guess she fixed up the second floor," Mr. Sterling added. "She and her husband plan to use the place weekends. I'll pass word along to Mrs. Marshall that you were in." "I left a note but didn't sign it," Nancy said. "Perhaps sometime I'll drop in person and thank the Marshalls." Returning to the car, she told Helen what she had learned. "Just for fun, let's go out to the bungalow now." A quarter of a mile farther on, Nancy made a right-hand turn which brought them onto the lake drive. Below them, the girls could see the bungalow they had visited. Suddenly, a black foreign car pulled out of the lane that led down to the bungalow. Gaining speed, the automobile came toward Nancy's convertible. "Watch out!" Helen yelled, jerking to attention as the vehicle passed and nearly sideswiped them. Nancy slowed down and stopped. She looked back at the car, which was almost out of sight. "Some drivers don't deserve a license," she said. "Do you suppose that was Mr. Marshall?" Helen shrugged. He wore a straw hat pulled low over his forehead. All I could see was the sleeve of his tan and white jacket. "That's quite a bit," Nancy teased, "in so short a time." Helen laughed. Close association with you is making me more observant," she said. When the girls reached the Pinecrest Motel, Helen exclaimed, "There's Aunt June!" While Nancy parked, the dark-haired girl slipped from the convertible and hurried to the porch outside the room they occupied. "Hello, Helen dear." The slim, stylishly dressed woman with softly waved black hair smiled at her niece. Helen returned the greeting and gave her father's younger sister a kiss. "When did you arrive?" she asked. "Have you been waiting long?" "No, I got here half an hour ago." The attractive-looking woman was a buyer for a River Heights department store. She told Helen of a retailing problem which had prevented her departure with the girls, then turned to greet Nancy with enthusiasm. "Isn't this a lovely spot?" Nancy remarked, and Aunt June Corning agreed that the view of the lake was superb. After learning that Aunt June had not had lunch, the three went into the tea room. When they had given their order, Miss Corning said, "I have some slightly bad news for you, Nancy." "What's happened?" "Well, just before I left River Heights, I phoned your housekeeper to see if he had any messages for you. To my surprise, Dr. Darby answered. He said that Mrs. Gruen had sprained her ankle early this morning, and she must not walk for a couple of days." "I'll call Dad right away and talk to him," said Nancy with concern. "Wait," Aunt June said. "Dr. Darby mentioned that your father left on a business trip today before the accident occurred." "That means Hannah is all alone," Nancy said, rising. "I'll have to go home at once. Will you both excuse me for a minute, please?" She went to a telephone booth and dialed Drew's next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gleason. Nancy was relieved to hear that the woman's sister was taking care of Hannah for the afternoon. The housekeeper was in no pain and resting comfortably. The young sleuth did some rapid thinking. If she left for River Heights late that afternoon, she could still fulfill her promise to Laura to meet her guardian and arrive home in time to cook Hannah's supper. "Will you please tell Mrs. Gruen I'll see her at 6 o'clock?" Nancy requested, and Mrs. Gleason agreed to do so. When Nancy returned to the others, Helen was telling her aunt of the adventure on the lake and Laura Pendleton's story. "How dreadful for the girl!" exclaimed Miss Corning. "I feel very sorry for her." Nancy now told of her plans to return home, and although Helen and her aunt were disappointed, they agreed it was the right thing to do. "But before I leave," said Nancy, "I want to meet Mr. and Mrs. Aborn." After lunch, Nancy packed her suitcase, put it in the car, and paid her motel bill. Soon it was time for her and Helen to leave for Montewego Hotel. "Are you sure you won't accompany us, Aunt June?" asked Helen. Miss Corning shook her head. "I'm a little tired," she said, "and besides, I must unpack." A short while later, the two girls entered the Montewego lobby. Nancy made her way directly to the desk and after a brief wait was informed that Miss Pendleton would receive the girls in her suite. An elevator took them to the 3rd floor. Scarcely had they knocked on the door when Laura opened it. "Oh, I'm so glad you came!" she cried out, smiling with relief. Laura led the girls into a well-appointed living room with a bedroom on either side. As Nancy stepped inside, she saw a man and a woman seated in chairs near a picture window. In a glance, Nancy realized that she and Helen had been right about Mrs. Aborn being the woman they had met the night before. Right now, she looked more friendly. Jacob Aborn rose and smiled graciously. He was a well-built, somewhat stocky man in his early 50s. His face was square, and his small brown eyes were shifting. When Laura introduced the girls, Mrs. Aborn rushed toward them. "Darlings!" she said, giving Helen and Nancy a butterfly peck on their cheeks. "You've been so good to poor Laura." "Perfect bricks," Mr. Aborn said gruffly. He extended a hand first to Nancy, then to Helen. "The reason I'm late in getting Laura is that I want everything to be perfect for her arrival at our Melrose Lake house." Nancy was sure Mrs. Aborn recognized the callers and was embarrassed to admit it. They said nothing. There was an awkward silence until Laura said, "Well, let's sit down." For a few moments, everyone chatted generally. Then Helen asked, "When are you leaving, Mr. Aborn?" "In half an hour," was the reply. "Laura is tired, and I want to get her settled before supper time." Mrs. Aborn broke in, "Yes, the poor child needs a lot of rest and good care." Laura Pendleton seemed to be annoyed to be treated as a child and an invalid. "I'm fine," she stated defiantly. Turning to Nancy, she said quietly, "I'm afraid we can't attend the hotel tea dance." "That's all right," Nancy replied. She told of Hannah's accident and the fact that she must soon head for home. "Are you all packed, Laura?" Mr. Aborn asked. "Yes, except to get Mother's jewelry from the hotel safe." "I'll do that for you, dear," Mrs. Aborn volunteered, rising. She smoothed her skirt restlessly. Laura said, "Thank you, but I must present the receipt in person." She excused herself, saying that she would be right back. As Laura left the suite, Mr. Aborn turned to the two guests. "I wish Marie Pendleton had been a little more cautious with her inheritance from her husband," he confided. "What do you mean?" Nancy asked. "Laura's practically penniless," her guardian explained. "Mrs. Pendleton's illness and the way she lived took up almost all their funds." Nancy and Helen were surprised and dismayed to hear this. "It doesn't matter, though," Mrs. Aborn said. "We've ample means to provide for Laura. She'll have everything she needs." Nancy was confused by the woman's seemingly dual personality. She could be as crude as on the evening before, or as sweet as she appeared now. Perhaps, at heart, she meant well. So, Nancy hoped so for Laura's sake, but a strange feeling of distrust persisted. When Laura returned, Helen and Nancy said they must be on their way. The friends shook hands. "We can never thank you enough, Laura, for coming to our rescue yesterday," Helen said gratefully. "That's right," Nancy agreed. "If you hadn't come along at that moment, we'd probably be at the bottom of the lake." Laura shuddered. "Oh, I'm sure you would have reached the shore some way, but I'm glad I could help, and it's been such fun knowing you. I hope you'll come see me while I'm at Melrose Lake." "We will," Nancy promised. "What's your address there?" "Anyone can direct you to my house," Mr. Aborn said heartily. "It's well known in that section." His wife tapped her foot on the floor. "Jacob, it's getting late," she hinted. Nancy and Helen hastily bid the Aborns goodbye and walked toward the door of the suite with Laura. Suddenly Helen turned around. "It's lucky you brought 2 cars," she called back. "Laura has a lot of luggage." Without another word, Helen gave Laura a quick kiss and walked into the corridor. Nancy followed a moment later. "Why did you say that?" Nancy questioned Helen as they rode down in the elevator. The dark-haired girl signaled for silence. There were several other people in the car. When they stepped out into the lobby, Nancy repeated her question. Helen grabbed her chum's arm excitedly. "I couldn't resist it," she exclaimed. "Jacob Aborn was the driver in the tan and white sports jacket I saw coming out of the road by the bungalow this morning. The driver of that black foreign car."